You have also written extensively about the recent cloud in relationship between India and Canada, and I would really like to pick your brain on that subject, which is pretty important in terms of how India engages with the rest of the world going forward. Now, you tried to make sense of the worsening Canada India feud in one of your interviews last October. Since then, the unknown case in the USA has added a new twist to it. So, what's your latest assessment on this view?
So first of all, I think it's important to remember that I think the U.S. and West has been relatively restrained in its response to to allegations of Indian complicity in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada and the alleged plot to kill Pannu. I think with respect to the U.S. case, the allegations don't appear to have done the same level of damage to the bilateral relationship as it has in the case of the India-Canada relationship. I think this is partially a result of the U.S. approach, which has been more subtle, more low-key. It's been, the U.S. has handled the issue more discreetly. It waited until it had legally admissible evidence before confronting India. Also, I think there's a degree of power politics at work here. The U.S. is obviously a much more significant power than Canada. So it's much easier for India to retaliate to Canada's allegations than it can to the U.S. allegations. Ultimately, I think the degree of damage to the relations of the West is likely to be limited, given the desire by Western countries to deepen relations with India as a bulwark against the rise of China. However, I think these incidents have also highlighted potential limits on relations between India and the West, particularly in sensitive areas like intelligence cooperation. It may have also tarnished India's image in the West as a proponent of the rules-based international order, and it may force Western countries to more openly acknowledge concerns about India's human rights record, for instance, or allegations of democratic backsliding. But ultimately, I think, as I said, Western countries have invested a lot of political capital in their relations with India, which they will not want to sacrifice.
Thank you, Dr. Bajpaee, for accepting the invitation to participate in this documentary series. Much appreciated. We want views of experts from reputed think tanks from around the world, such as Wilson Center US and Chatham House UK. So I'm very glad that you're representing Chatham House today. And we will be getting into some of the areas of expertise that you have in order to cover the various topics in this documentary. Let's begin then. When you think of India today in the eyes of the world, what are the 2 or 3 words that jump to your mind?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. But yeah, I think on your question on the key words that come to mind, I think the first word that comes to mind is Amrit Kal. So that this is very much a critical period for India. Another word that comes to mind is that India is in a geopolitical sweet spot. That India is in a period of strategic opportunity, and this has, I think, very much been driven by its recent developments as India being the world's fastest growing major economy, on course to become the world's third largest economy by the end of this decade, world's largest population, demographic dividend, from its G20 presidency to its space program, to its bid to host the 2036 Olympics. The country has very much been in the spotlight. And I think this has been further fueled by a favorable political and geopolitical environment, with the slowdown in the Chinese economy, India being a potential beneficiary of tensions in the US China relationship, and an investor friendly government in New Delhi that has a strong mandate.
Okay. Now, this documentary is about the foreign policy record of India in the past decade under the leadership of Mr. Narendra Modi. So, when you think of Mr. Modi as a person and as a prime minister, what are the few words that jump to your mind?
So I think there are two sides to Prime Minister Modi. There's this reform-driven agenda, and then there's this somewhat more divisive, identity-driven politics. And I think both have run in parallel. And as a result, I think when I think about words to describe Prime Minister Modi, I would say he's on the one hand he's highly charismatic, he's a strong leader, he's a shrewd politician, he's a can-do person. But at the same time, he's also someone who's somewhat controversial and divisive. So I think there are two sides to the story when it comes to Prime Minister Modi.
Okay. Now let's get into your areas of expertise. You have extensive experience with financial markets as a political risk analyst for Asia. So, what is your risk analysis for India?
So I think India is a potential beneficiary of the push to de-risk or diversify supply chains away from China. We've seen this in areas from iPhones to electrical vehicles. But I think India still has a long way to go in replacing China as a factory of the world. Its manufacturing is stuck at about 14% of GDP. I think this is attributed to several factors. I think first and foremost, one has to recognize that India is a large and complex country. I would argue it's less comparable to China and more to the European Union, given its federalized and highly decentralized political system. The country faces several structural challenges, particularly in areas of infrastructure, logistics, and tariffs. The questions over the quality of its labor, and there's also challenges in trying to implement politically sensitive reforms in such areas as land acquisition, labor, and agriculture. So I think India undoubtedly has strong potential, but translating that potential into actual capability, I think, remains a potential challenge.
Okay, all right. In one of your recent articles, you write that India can be a peacemaker to the world and is well positioned to play a mediating role in various conflicts. Do you see that role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for instance, and Israel-Palestine conflict?
So I think this role for India to be a potential mediator or peacemaker, it's not a new role. I mean, I think it comes through its long-standing commitment to strategic autonomy or multi or omni alignment in its foreign policy. So that which has allowed the government or the country to maintain engagement with all major poles of influence in the international system. Under the Modi government, this has been reframed as the idea of India as a Vishwamitra or a friend of the world. However, I think there is a difference between being a friend of the world and helping the world make friends with each other. So I think India is well positioned to play the role of a peacemaker, but there are questions about India's willingness to play such a role. And if I just take the example of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, aside from the much touted statement by Prime Minister Modi that now is not the era of war, India's role has really been quite limited and largely driven by self-interest. And if you contrast this with India's role during various conflicts in the 1950s, from the Korean War to the French Indochina War, India played a more prominent mediating role during these conflicts. I think where India's role as a bridging power has been more evident is as a voice of the global South, which became evident during its G20 presidency last year. This idea that India could act as a bridge between the West and the global South by offering a worldview that's non-Western but not explicitly anti-Western, unlike say China or Iran or Russia.
Okay. Now, when it comes to China, it's undoubtedly the biggest security risk as well as economic competitor for India. So, what's your analysis of the Indo-China strategic rivalry and its implications for the world for the rest of the 21st century?
So I think the China-India relationship has entered a new normal since about 2020, when both countries had their border clashes that resulted in the first fatalities in over 40 years. The situation that essentially existed from 1988 to 2020, where both sides agreed to shelve the border dispute and work on other aspects of the bilateral relationship, it came to a halt after the Galwan Valley clashes in June of 2020. In terms of what this means for the world, I think first it has pushed India closer to the US and the West. We've seen this with India's growing participation in a number of US or Western-led initiatives, from the Quad to the EU-India Trade and Technology Council to the Mineral Security Partnership to the Artemis Accords. It also means that we will continue to see, or as we continue to see, the rise of China and India as major regional and global powers. Both countries are going to acquire more tools and platforms to interact with each other. So this will essentially project the bilateral relationship to the regional and global levels. And this means that we could see frictions play out on issues of global governance, from debt sustainability to technology standards, for instance.
Okay. Now, you have also written extensively about the recent cloud in relationship between India and Canada, and I would really like to pick your brain on that subject, which is pretty important in terms of how India engages with the rest of the world going forward. Now, you tried to make sense of the worsening Canada India feud in one of your interviews last October. Since then, the unknown case in the USA has added a new twist to it. So, what's your latest assessment on this view?
So first of all, I think it's important to remember that I think the US and West has been relatively restrained in its response to to allegations of Indian complicity in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada and the alleged plot to kill Pannu. I think with respect to the US case, the allegations don't appear to have done the same level of damage to the bilateral relationship as it has in the case of the India-Canada relationship. I think this is partially a result of the US approach, which has been more subtle, more low-key. It's been, the US has handled the issue more discreetly. It waited until it had legally admissible evidence before confronting India. Also, I think there's a degree of power politics at work here. The US is obviously a much more significant power than Canada. So it's much easier for India to retaliate to Canada's allegations than it can to the US allegations. Ultimately, I think the degree of damage to the relations of the West is likely to be limited, given the desire by Western countries to deepen relations with India as a bulwark against the rise of China. However, I think these incidents have also highlighted potential limits on relations between India and the West, particularly in sensitive areas like intelligence cooperation. It may have also tarnished India's image in the West as a proponent of the rules-based international order, and it may force Western countries to more openly acknowledge concerns about India's human rights record, for instance, or allegations of democratic backsliding. But ultimately, I think, as I said, Western countries have invested a lot of political capital in their relations with India, which they will not want to sacrifice.
Okay. Now, your comment about the credibility in terms of the rules-based order takes me to my next question. Recently, when American troops were killed in a drone strike in Jordan, President Biden said the United States will hold all those responsible to account at a time and in a manner of our choosing. Tomorrow, if the Indian Prime Minister were to make the same statement against India's enemies, would the Western leaders and media extend the same understanding and support?
Well, I think it depends on the context. So I think first it's important to remember that India's intelligence services have been very active in neighboring countries in South Asia for decades. But the cases in Canada and the US were game changers to a degree, because these are countries which are G7, Five Eyes member states, NATO member states. So I think it does indicate that there are limits on where India can carry out such operations. And this may be a potential point of friction as India expands its global intelligence footprint. I mean, frankly, it may come across as double standards, but that is the nature of international relations and power politics.
Okay. Now, obviously, these kind of situations require a leader who is very adept, shrewd, pragmatic, if not ideological, because we academics tend to take ideological stand, whereas the politicians need to take pragmatic stand. Now, let's take that to the US, where Mr. Trump is very likely to come back to power, going by the recent polls. So, how well do you think Mr. Modi will be able to manage the mercurial Mr. Trump if both of them come back to power this year?
So I've just recently traveled to Washington D.C. So I had the opportunity to ask the same question, and I think despite the highly polarized political environment in the United States, I think there's a high degree of bipartisan consensus in Washington on engaging India. In fact, I would argue that the two countries where there's the highest degree of bipartisan consensus are China as the long-term strategic rival and India as the long-term strategic partner. We've seen that the US India relationship has continued to deepen both under Democrat and Republican administrations over the last 2 decades, including the first Trump administration. I think there are undoubtedly some concerns given Trump's proclivity to pursue a more unpredictable and transactional foreign policy. And this could manifest in areas of trade and immigration as potential areas of friction. But I think the relationship will continue to deepen, irrespective of who wins the US presidential election in November.
Okay. Now, if we were to take that support for granted and imagine a scenario where the border situation between India and China worsens, uh, would you think the mercurial Mr. Trump would steadfastly support India?
I would lean towards yes. And I think this is because the key rationale for US engagement, as I said, is with India, is promoting India as a bulwark against the rise of China. So, as the US China strategic rivalry grows, the rationale for deepening engagement with India will also grow. This doesn't mean that the US will come to India's aid in the event of a conflict with China. Um, India is not an alliance partner of the United States, and as such, I think the U.S. role during a potential U.S. India-China conflict would be limited to providing intelligence, arms, diplomatic support, rather than any direct involvement in any conflict between both countries.
Okay. Now, at the recent Raisina dialogues in Delhi, Dr. Jaishankar, India's foreign minister, suggested that it's not Russia but China that the West needs to focus on and confront headlong, as China is the main culprit in trying to destabilize the rules based world order. Would you agree?
Yes, to a degree. I think Russia is a disruptive but declining power, while China, despite the slowdown in its economy in recent years, remains a long-term strategic rival of the United States. So, despite the slowdown in China's overseas investment, China remains a prominent player in large parts of the global South, and it's seeking to offer an alternative worldview through its Belt and Road Initiative and its global development, security, and civilization initiatives. I'm not sure I would go as far as saying that it's trying to destabilize the rules based global order, but it is definitely trying or seeking to change that order.
Okay. Now, India has steadfastly stood by Russia despite its escalating tension with the West. Is it India's way of managing the multipolar world? And what are the dangers in managing this kind of a tight rope walk?
I think that's part of the answer. I mean, India's commitment to strategic autonomy and its historical relationship with Russia. I think also relevant are practical considerations such as India's dependence on Russian military hardware. 60% of its in service military platforms are of Russian origin. India's dependence on discounted Russian crude, which spiked from about 2% of its oil imports before the war to over or close to 20% after the war began. And I think at the same time, despite statements of support for Russia, the reality is that India has been gradually downgrading its relationship with Russia. We've seen this with Prime Minister Modi not holding a summit meeting with President Putin since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2021. We've seen this with India's relatively low key presidency of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization last year. So I think I would argue that India is trying to manage the decline of its relationship with Moscow as Russia becomes increasingly beholden to China, and India seeks to deepen its relationship with the West.
Okay. Now, when it comes to India and China, history seems to repeat itself. After independence, we started with the Chietigj Bajpaee under Jawaharlal Nehru's leadership. Mr. Modi also, when he came to power, he held three bilateral summits, both in China as well as in India. It started off on a very good note, but since then it has really taken a nasty turn with deaths on both the sides. So, in your assessment, what has gone right and what's gone wrong in this toxic relationship?
So I think there's been a degree of naivety in how India has viewed China, as you alluded to in your question. So I think historically there's been a tendency by New Delhi to see China through the lens of a fellow developing country and an Asian power, and this led to, as you said, the infamous slogan of Chietigj Bajpaee in the 1950s, which proclaimed that India and China are brothers. I think that naivety has disappeared to a degree, particularly after the Galwan Valley clashes in 2020. I think India has become more aware of China as a rival and competitor, and that's also explains part of the reason why it's willing to work more closely with the United States and the West in confronting concerns about China. But at the same time, despite Indian efforts to say tighten foreign investment regulations, imposing bans on Chinese apps such as TikTok, restricting investment in strategically important sectors, India remains China's China remains India's second largest trading partner. So I think this will also impose limits on the degree to which India can really decouple from China, given the high degree of interdependence between both economies. On the positive side, I think this interdependence will also limit the degree or likelihood of conflict between both countries.
Okay. Now, in any country's effort to improve its international standing and stature, its economy plays a very important role. The better your economy, the better your international standing, and the more countries will listen to you. Now, India currently ranks as the fifth largest economy globally, with Prime Minister Modi aiming to elevate it to the third position in the next 5 years and achieve developed nation status by 2047. So, what is your assessment of India's progress versus its potential as a global economic powerhouse in both the past decade as well as the decade ahead?
So, as you mentioned, yeah, India currently ranks as the world's fifth largest economy. It's on course to be the third by the end of this decade. And this is up from the 10th largest economy when the Modi government assumed power back in 2014. I think part of this is a result of a slowdown in other major economies. So, for instance, as the shrinking Hong Kong stock market has led the Indian stock market to surpass Hong Kong as the world's fourth largest equity market. Similarly, India surpassed the UK as the world's fifth largest economy at a time when the UK is experiencing low growth and it entered recession. But at the same time, I think the government has implemented several policies to make India a more attractive investment destination. So, to its credit, the Modi government has come to recognize that the earlier view that India could somehow skip the manufacturing revolution and go straight from an agriculture to service based economy was not sustainable. So I think India's famed IT sector only employs about 5.5 million people. So that's a very small proportion of the overall workforce. And this has prompted the government to introduce several policies such as Make in India, production linked incentives, which incentivizes investment in strategically important sectors. So I think that the country is on the right track, but it still has a long way to go. As mentioned, manufacturing is still stuck at about 14% of GDP.
Okay. Now, with the current superpowers on the decline, it's quite likely that the 21st century is going to be an Asia-centric century, particularly with rivalry between China and India. What steps you believe India needs to take to bridge the economic gap with China, for instance, in trade imbalance?
So I think India needs to implement several structural reforms, ranging from issues of infrastructure to logistics to tariffs. I think India still remains inherently protectionist despite the conclusion of a string of recent free trade agreements. As I mentioned on the issue of infrastructure and logistics, there has been a significant amount of progress through the Make in India scheme, through Gati Shakti scheme, which aims to improve last mile infrastructure connectivity, and the production linked incentive scheme. But I think there is still a long way to go. I think another issue is improving the quality of its labor. So India isn't labor constrained, but the quality of its labor is a potential constraint. So there's need for more investment in human capital, focus on skills development, employment generation. There's a challenge of creating, I think, almost 1 million jobs per month, or 200 million jobs over the next decade. So that I think is a significant challenge facing the government. And then perhaps most importantly is the challenge of implementing politically sensitive reforms in areas such as land acquisition and labor reforms. We've seen, for instance, the protests that have taken place both back in 2021 and more recently against attempts to try and implement politically insensitive agricultural reforms by these protests by farmers. So I think these are some of the key bottlenecks or challenges for India to really be able to bridge the economic gap with China.
Okay. Now, I would like to ask you a supplementary question on this because it's, I think, important to compare the trajectory of China's growth in the last 4 decades as well as now India's growth currently. Now, when China started growing in the 1980s, obviously it used infrastructure and manufacturing as a main vehicle of employment growth. But now that India is growing, unfortunately, in the digital economy, one can achieve growth without concurrent increase in job growth. So, how do you think India is going to reconcile with this job creation agenda that it needs to have? If it were to grow, further.
I think that will be a key challenge. Yeah, I don't think India can emulate the model that China followed, or for that matter, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the other Asian tiger economies did. I think we are in a different world order and a different. The way the global economy functions has changed. So I think it's a more service-based economy, and I think that obviously offers India some potential advantages, given its strengths in terms of its strong digital ecosystem and IT educated workforce. But as I said, I think that I think it's not possible to sort of shift from a large agriculture based economy straight into a large service based economy. It will not be able to provide sufficient employment. So there is a need to develop that manufacturing potential and capability, even if it's not possible to emulate the Chinese model or the model by the other Asian tiger economies. That is the
Mhm.
only way that one will be able to generate sufficient employment for
Okay.
India's large workforce, over 550 million.
Mhm. Okay. Now let's come to Pakistan, another country of expertise that you have. Now, is it fair to describe Pakistan as the snake in the backyard dancing to the tune of China?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think, as much as China and Pakistan see each other as all-weather allies, I think India clearly sees both countries as all-weather rivals. I think Pakistan has lost some of its strategic significance to India in recent years, as India has continued to grow in global significance, while Pakistan has been mired in domestic political, security, and economic crises. We saw this with Pakistan's election in February, which reaffirmed the country's dysfunctional politics. The country is in the midst of its 23rd IMF bailout. It's still recovering from the devastating impacts of floods, which hit the country 2 years ago, suffered from a string of terrorist attacks. That being said, I don't think India can dismiss Pakistan. Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state. It has the world's sixth largest army, the world's fifth largest population. So instabilities in Pakistan will have regional and global ramifications. And I think in the worst case scenario, another large scale terrorist attack on India emanating from Pakistan would lead to a mobilization of both countries' militaries, similar to what we saw back in the early 2000s. So I think it would be an exaggeration to say that Pakistan is pulling the strings of or China is pulling the strings of Pakistan's foreign policy. That doesn't really grant sufficient agency to Pakistan. But I think it remains a genuine concern for
Okay.
India.
Okay. So let's try to look at it from a positive lens in terms of the future of India Pakistan relationship, particularly in terms of trade. Yesterday, Pakistan Prime Minister made a statement that there has been a pressure from the businessmen in Pakistan to restart economic relationship with India. So, do you think, considering the kind of economic abyss that Pakistan reached, that India was in 1991, that might kind of change the mindset of the army and the political establishment to change the trajectory of Pakistan's relation with India?
So I think in the run-up to the Pakistani general elections in February, there were some hopes that if Nawaz Sharif had returned to power as prime minister, that there would be an improvement in India-Pakistan relations. Relations have historically improved when he's been in power. We saw that with the Lahore bus diplomacy in 1999. Prime Minister Modi actually visited him in 2015 on his birthday in Pakistan in Lahore. So I think there were some hopes that would lead to a potential rapprochement. That is obviously no longer the case. You have this unstable coalition government led by Shahbaz Sharif, and he's seen to be highly beholden to the so-called establishment, the military and intelligence services. So I mean, there is growing recognition that given Pakistan's dire economic situation and security situation, that it does need to improve relations with India. Whether that is really truly possible, because ultimately it is the establishment, the military intelligence services, that are pulling the strings of the country's foreign policy, and their rationale for having this overwhelming influence in Pakistani politics and increasing the economy is justified by the need of facing up to these external threats, and most notably India. So I think that is a key question. I think the other important watch point will what would be the implications of a potential third term uh, Modi government in New Delhi, and given the fact that you have a government in India with a very strong mandate and very strong credentials in terms of its Hindu nationalist credentials, that Prime Minister Modi may be in a position to make some concessions, put out an olive branch to potentially try and improve relations, as most Indian prime ministers have done as they approach their end of their
Mhm.
their tenure.
Yeah.
That's a key legacy issue. That if
Yeah.
they can resolve the Kashmir issue, if they can resolve tensions with Pakistan, so I think as the saying goes, "Tali dono haath se bajti hai." So it takes two to tango. So I think you need to have the right
Mhm.
situation on both sides of the border. I don't think that really exists, frankly, in Pakistan. It's given the highly unstable government that you have, which is highly beholden to the military establishment. So I think I'm not as optimistic of a imminent improvement in relations.
Okay. Now, let's come to the concluding set of questions on this documentary on tracing India's global footprints. Uh, Now, in terms of the international image, from snake charmer to IT services giant to Chandrayaan 3, India has come a long way in the eyes of the world. In your own experience, how has the worldview of India changed, particularly in terms of its soft power?
So I think, in terms of its soft power, I think there's been a renewed effort by the government to promote India as a civilizational state. Part of this has been really focusing on India's soft power credentials, from yoga to Buddhism. I think there's been an effort to improve relations with the diaspora community. I think that's also been an important component of the soft power. India has the world's largest diaspora, 18 million strong. And I think there's been a renewed effort under the Modi government to reach out to these communities. Historically, I think India has held these communities to arm's length, but now we're seeing that these are people that can be a source of strength, that they can be cheerleaders for India. We saw the very warm reception that Prime Minister Modi has received from overseas Indian communities when he's traveled abroad. But also, I think there are two sides to the coin. The other side of it is that it's a potential source of friction when these communities engaged in activities that are challenge India's status or sovereignty, and this was obviously the case in the India Canada
Mhm.
relationship. So I think there are two sides to that coin. But yeah, in general, I think there has been a renewed effort in recent years to promote India as a civilizational state. We've seen this with the use of this vernacular, referring to India as a Vishwamitra, as a Vishwa Guru, as a teacher of the world, Vasudeva Kutumbakum, and the use of the term Bharat. So I think that there is a definite and concerted effort to promote India's soft power status.
Okay. Now, you talked about the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The Modi government has indeed taken several measures in that regard, whether it is vaccine diplomacy, saving people from conflict zones around the world, batting for climate change accord, and so on. And particularly being the leader of the global South, admitting, Africa into G20 and so on. So, do you think we are on the path to secure the support of the at least developing world to get a seat in the Security Council at the United Nations?
Well, ultimately, and perhaps unfortunately, to get a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, there are only five countries that really matter. So you need to get obviously it's important to rally the rest of the world around India's ambition to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. But it's the five permanent members that really count, and we have support from four of those five permanent members. So I think the key challenge here is what is China's position. And I think that is, as I referred to earlier, I think increasingly we will see the bilateral relationship and frictions in the bilateral relationship play out on issues of global governance. So we've seen, for instance, not only has China not supported India's permanent seat on the UN Security Council, President Xi Jinping did not attend the G20 summit in New Delhi last year. There's been frictions on issues of debt restructuring, for instance, with respect to Sri Lanka. Um, Even on climate negotiations, which were once an area of cooperation and convergence, they're increasingly pursuing uh, divergent positions. So I think that is going to be a key challenge facing India as it seeks to emerge as a regional and global power, and emerge as a voice of the global South, because you have a key country challenging India's ambitions, and that is China, whether it be its permanent seat on the UN Security Council or its ambitions to play the role of the leader or voice of the global South.
Okay. Now, there is no doubt that the institutions that were established, at the end of Second World War, including the United Nations, have basically outlived their utility, and the format that they are in at the moment is really not reflective of the current reality of the 21st century. So, Mr. Modi is known for out-of-the-box thinking, out-of-the-box action, at least in domestic politics. Do you think he will pull a rabbit out of his hat and maybe try to establish an alternate structure to United Nations going forward?
I don't think that we would see an alternative to the United Nations necessarily, but I think what we are seeing is more ad hoc issue-based initiatives that are emerging. So whether it be the Mineral Security Partnership on the issue of critical minerals, or the Artemis Accords, which is on the governance of space, or the Quad, which is addressing several issues ranging from maritime security to supply chain resilience. I think we are seeing these what is sometimes referred to as mini-laterals initiatives that are emerging between like-minded countries, more value-driven initiatives. So, the Quad, for instance, are Asia's four key maritime democracies: Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. So I think that is a sign of things to come. And of course, it's not just India that is pushing these initiatives, but the China as well. So the BRICS, for instance, its Belt and Road Initiative, and I think these are also pushing alternative models of global governance that are essentially challenging the Bretton Woods system. It's interesting in the case of the BRICS or the expanded BRICS that India is also a member, and it's so one of the initiatives that's being pushed by the BRICS is the de-dollarization of bilateral trade, uh, both as a means of encouraging trade in your own currency, so whether it be the rupee or the renminbi, but also as a means to potentially evade Western sanctions or punitive measures that are used, or we've seen it particularly being used in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely a sign of way to come, and we are going to see a growing spaghetti bowl of regional and global initiatives as we see that the established forms, the Bretton Woods institutions, are increasingly challenged or seen to be out of sync with the global balance of power.
Okay. Thank you. So, finally, what would be your advice to the government that comes to power after the May elections? What's the best way forward for the next government of India?
So I think there's a couple of issues that I would think. I think first and foremost, it needs to follow through on its reform agenda. As I mentioned, these issues of agriculture, labor, land acquisition, focusing on skills development, employment generation. I think India trying to live up to its manufacturing potential. I think that will be one key issue that it needs to focus on. The second is operationalizing its foreign policy initiatives. The West has shown itself to be eager to work with India in the global South, and we very much saw this during the G20 presidency, when there was a lot of emphasis placed on the issue of digital public infrastructure as a means of improving digital inclusion, improving welfare disbursements, empowering citizens that previously lacked health access to formal healthcare or education or banking systems. So I think, but these initiatives very much remain in their infancy. And in many parts of the global South, China remains the only game in town. So I think India still needs to, there's still a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And then I think finally, India's ability to really stand up to China, it doesn't just rest on its material capabilities; it also rests on its ideas. And this includes the idea of India as the world's largest democracy, and that the idea that it offers a more benign worldview than China. But I think, given concerns or some concerns about democratic backsliding or India becoming an illiberal democracy, this could weaken that narrative. So I think that's also an area that needs some degree of focus. renewing or the emphasis on India's democratic credentials, um, focusing on some of these structural reforms, and operationalizing these foreign policy initiatives that India has spoken about in recent years.
Mhm. Thank you, Mr. Bajpaee. It's been a really, enlightening journey going through the, geopolitical issues across the world, particularly in the context of South Asia. Really appreciate your time and contribution to this documentary. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.